Cool, wonderful. So I hope everyone enjoyed that nice lunch break. So yes, this is the second session, Why Capitalism Needs to Grow. So I'm Despine, I'll be chairing, and Adam will be giving the introduction. So we've already heard, a set of really interesting introductions already today, which have been talking about examples of capitalist and imperialist environmental destruction. Having these facts to hand is really important for being able to intervene in environmental movement, especially in the run-up to COP26. This still leaves us with questions as to why it is that capitalism and imperialism have to act in this way, why it is that they have to be environmentally destructive, and crucially, why it is that capitalism and imperialism need to continue to increase this plunder of the world's natural resources and to increase this oppression of peoples in underdeveloped nations as well. So this is what Adam is going to be addressing in his introduction today. He'll be talking about the basics of the political economy of capitalism and of imperialism. So even if you don't know what these terms mean now, hopefully you will do by the end of the session. And then after his introduction, there'll be a space for further discussion, again, talking hopefully to develop on some of the themes in Adam's introduction. And just so we can have a better grasp of, the fundamental principles of why it is that capitalism needs to grow and why it has to be environmentally destructive. So with that, I'll hand over to Adam.
Thanks, Despine. So I wanted to just start with a quick quote from the front page article of the new paper, which says that despite the promises of the politicians, despite their green commitments, the reality is that the banks and fossil fuel multinationals have no intention of curtailing their planet-burning activities. Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, the 60 largest private banks have invested $3.8 trillion in fossil fuels. The big five British banks invested $190 billion between 2018 and 2020. The 2021 Fossil Fuel Finance Report, Banking on Climate Chaos, described Barclays as the worst in Europe, and the seventh largest investor plowing $145 billion between 2016 and 2020 into fossil fuels. And other banks are similar. In May 2021, a mere 14% of Barclays shareholders backed a resolution calling on the bank to align its fossil fuel investment policy with that required by the Paris Accord targets. And that was less than had sort of asked for that to be met in 2020. So, even the shareholders don't care about what's happening. So, we've obviously this makes it very clear that, the biggest financial institutions in the world are keen on fueling climate disaster. And so we've got to answer this question: why do they do that? And more broadly, more theoretically, why does capitalism need to grow? So I'm going to start by outlining the Marxist theory of capitalist crisis and what that means today in the era of imperialism. Then we can use that theory to analyse the green policies of the imperialist nations. And finally, I'll make some remarks on the historic progress of humanity, class struggle, and its relationship to the planetary organism. So, inasmuch as the purpose of human society is to produce use values which fulfil its needs, any period of human history which has a dominant form of social relations, therefore has a dominant mode of production. And for Marx, the mode of production of any period is the key characteristic of the stage of development in human history. And this so far in history has tended towards more sophisticated technology and more specialised branches of production. So, we think about the difference between now and 500 years ago in terms of the complexity of what's produced by humanity. Development of these sorts of productive forces has so far been driven by increasing exploitation of one economic class by another class. And, today, we're obviously in a capitalist society where we have two main classes, the working class and the bourgeoisie. So capitalism is one of these modes of production that Marx was talking about. The property-owning class exploits labour and natural resources to create commodities, which it appropriates and then exchanges on the market. So the means of production are privatised with these individual property owners, but the commodity has to be socialised, put into society in order for its value to be realised and in order for, the private owners to take that and make it into something else or hoard it or accumulate it. So although the bourgeoisie is a class with a role in the social order under capitalism, the incentives presented to individual members of it generate competition due to this contradiction. In order to keep some of the exchange value for himself, the individual must always seek to put less into the production process than they can get for the resultant commodity on the market. So any profit can only come at the cost of the value appropriated from labour and natural resources. And due to competition with other producers, which reduces the exchange value of the commodity, the individual is always under external pressure to increase exploitation just to stay profitable. So there's two main ways that this is done. Direct intensification of labour force exploitation. So, things like reducing wages, imposing longer hours, and then, productivity targets, fewer breaks, that sort of thing. And then the second way to increase profitability is, investing in means of production, which improves the efficiency by better machinery, that sort of thing, which reduces fixed costs as well. So the investment often means increasing the speed of production and consumption. And sort of what in the paper is sometimes called growing the economy. It's all about making capitalism speed up, making more commodities get produced. So relatively, obviously, the first thing I talked about, reducing wages and hours, that's inherently limited in a few ways that I'm not going to go into in detail, but so it, capitalists or, owners of capital tend to focus more on investing in machinery, and that's the main driver of industrial progress. This is why we've gone from, basic, steam engines to combustion engines, that sort of thing. So the bourgeoisie control what is produced, and they produce only what is profitable. This has two consequences in relation to the environment. Firstly, as we established, their incentive is to make private profit. They don't particularly care about environmental effects, which I mean here as well, effects on human welfare, if those effects don't impede on their production process in the short term. They'll just do whatever's cheapest. So, these processes have caused great damage to the environment, like we heard this morning, whether that's destructive mechanised extraction, pollution of an area that, is outside of their sort of realm of concern, or exploitation of local labour, which, all the human suffering that entails, effects on life expectancy, poverty, hunger. So, and the other consequence of this control they have over production is that there are no social institutions in our society which could check or temper their trend to exploit the natural world unsustainably. So, the most sophisticated and powerful social institutions are capitalist nation states and their associations like the UN, which, serve to maintain the present social order, to maintain capitalism and accelerate production. Any kind of true mass democracy is suppressed, as by definition, any such organisation will become a battleground for class struggle and would decide to unseat the bourgeoisie from their dominant position in society in order to meet the long-term needs of the majority. So we can see that there's no general solution to destruction of the environment under capitalism. So then I'm just going to move on to talking about imperialism. So obviously, as I said, FRFI, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism is the name of our paper, and it's a key enemy, I guess, of sort of the communist movement. It affects the class struggle, and how it affects the class struggle in contemporary Britain is sort of what we cover a lot. But I just wanted to read out this definition again from the front page of the paper. So, while the root cause of the crisis, the environmental crisis, lies in capitalism and its ceaseless search for profits to fuel its limitless self-expansion, this is not a complete explanation for the accelerating crisis. It is capitalism in its monopoly or imperialist phase that is relentlessly driving planet Earth to destruction. Imperialism is fundamentally monopoly capitalism. It is the historical period of the decay of capitalism and is characterised by parasitism. Imperialism is the era of finance capital, in which enormously concentrated banking capital has fused with industrial and commercial capital. The export of capital, which is to say global investment as opposed to the export of commodities, becomes the distinguishing feature of imperialism. As a result, capitalism has grown into a global system of national oppression and of financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. So, yeah, so this is sort of an important point, which is that, there are rich and poor nations, but also rich and poor in all nations. There's always a working class in all the capitalist countries, and by and large, the system doesn't work for them. But yeah, due to the nature of imperialism, like the large part of exploitation today we see taking place in those oppressed nations, particularly damage to the environment is most severe in other countries. So it's not always apparent from within Britain. And so the notion of any kind of green British economy requires dirty industry somewhere over the horizon. And just some facts and figures on this, there was a recent study conducted by the Worldwide Fund for Nature and Greenpeace, and they used the UK government's metrics for carbon emissions and calculated that the amount of CO2 production financed by Britain's banks and asset managers is nearly double the country's domestic carbon emissions. So, but in that study, the charities even accepted the government's terms of how these emissions are calculated. And this is a way in which these bodies actually serve to sort of argue that there is a sense of there is like a green capitalism, like is possible, by like omitting aviation and shipping from these calculations, because the UK has just decided they're strategically important, that there's no way that they could make them green, or they recognise that things like shipping, the way that commodities are brought from the oppressed nations into Britain is a big part of why Britain stays powerful in the world. So yeah, that's the next part of the talk, basically. So I didn't want to do that every time I said green, because it's a marketing term, right? It's used by defenders of capitalism to justify a fresh round of exploitation and to cast state subsidies investment directed to polluting industry in a positive light, in order to allay the anger of a population becoming increasingly aware of the damage done to the natural world in the name of progress and growth. And this is really apparent from looking at where sort of green state subsidies actually go. Things like, lithium mining. They're talking about opening lithium mines in Cornwall even. The automotive industry, when efficient, environmentally friendly solutions to mass transport are very obvious to anyone as being, more buses and more trains, but instead it's being used to fund electric cars, which are actually require more emit more carbon dioxide than producing a sort of combustion engine car in the process of their production, because the batteries are so nasty to make. They're also in subsidies like aerospace, which again, maybe we should just not fly around so much, wind, hydrogen power, and steel. And like with the term green, carbon neutral is another term that is very sort of loaded. It's really come out of these climate agreements. And if you read more in the paper about them, and also in FRFI 282, there's a good article about like carbon credits, which, I won't sort of go into now, but it's worth looking into. So, I'm just seeing how it is time. Okay, I've been talking 15 minutes. Shall I wrap up, or
if you just
go on? All right. So I just had this second point then about state subsidies and investment. So I think it's important to note that most of the post-pandemic sort of bailout spending that's been used to, sustain profitability in key industries, it's going specifically to developing carbon neutral energy production. It's important for capitalists that this comes before greening other areas of the economy, as cheap energy is a vital component of overall profitability in large swaths of the economy. At the moment, cheap domestic energy is maintained by a combination of price fixing and subsidies. So 85% of all global subsidies go to the fossil fuel industry, because fossil fuel production is so heavily mechanised that it's very unprofitable without any support. And the aim of this spending is to make carbon neutral energy prices competitive with fossil fuels. So in that way, this production would just come to supplement fossil fuel energy production, not necessarily reduce it, since energy requirements of capitalism are always expanding. And there's no way that green energy is going to expand quick enough to completely overtake the sort of proportionally overtake how much fossil fuels are used at the minute. So the only solution to avoid climate catastrophe is for the global economy to reduce production, but this isn't going to happen under a capitalist economy that has to grow. So as an example, one expert has calculated that to run Australia's economy on renewable energy entirely would cost it 3% of its GDP, which is pretty much the amount by which the Australian economy grows every year. So it's simply never going to happen. And you can think of examples when there were opportunities presented to the state, to capitalist states, to reduce fossil fuel production, such as like in spring 2020 when we had this like pandemic situation. Demand plummeted, but all they did was sort of just temporarily reduce production as part of the like OPEC oil cartel, which controls fossil fuel production, in order to stabilise prices. And then, the state bailed out the infrastructure of fossil fuel distribution and stuff so that it was ready to come roaring back later in the year. In Britain, March 2021, the government approved tax cuts on domestic flights. It's frozen fuel duty on petrol and diesel. Earlier in the year, they green-lighted a project to build the country's first deep coal mine in 30 years. And Britain also continues to support fossil fuel production abroad, such as financing construction of a major gas export terminal in Mozambique. So coal use alone was 4% higher in the last quarter of 2020 than the last quarter of 2019 across the world. And a UN report at the end of 2020 has found that nations are planning production increases in coal, oil and gas of 2% a year. And this is obviously well above their own targets, let alone the kind of targets that are actually required to stop global warming. And another report that came out said that extractive resources would increase from 79 to 167 billion tonnes between now and 2060, modelled on an annual 2.8% global growth in GDP. So that's like 111% increase overall in extracted resources, with a 150% increase in metals and a 135% increase in minerals. So, that's more than double the destruction that already takes place that is being projected to sustain the economy just up to 2060 on the sort of same growth level that it's had so far. So it becomes really obvious that these sort of subsidies and these investments are just tipping green industries into profitability for the immediate benefit of the capitalist class. And I've got a couple of quotes here one's from Larry Fink from the investment firm BlackRock, who said that, "I have great optimism about the future of capitalism and the future health of the economy, not in spite of the energy transition, but because of it." And the month before that, Boris Johnson pledged to make the City of London the global centre of green finance. And then he was also reported at some conference this week playing a joke, a pun on the line from a film of "greed is good" by saying "green is good," which I thought kind of like he was writing my speech for me there, because if you think of it the other way around, this is why they're doing it. They're doing it for their greed, for the accumulation. But despite all this, the city does manage the flows of capital for some of the world's largest oil, mining and food multinationals. They're still way more important than green companies are. And if you look at the sponsors list for COP26, the climate conference coming up later this month, consumer goods giants like Unilever and Reckitt, principal partners, and these companies anticipate supporting the climate transition to be in their long-term interest. They want it to be a kind of climate transition where they can still mass produce these kind of things. So I think I've made my point there. So to sum up, our analysis of economic growth leads us to conclude that socialism is the only path to ecological and economic justice. The bourgeoisie cannot imagine a world without capitalist growth, so they determine that it's the working class that has to shrink, like this sort of modern-day Malthusian ideas. But even though capitalist social relations have led to very wasteful consumption of fuel and minerals, much more is produced than is needed. And this was touched on earlier, but the whole world could be well fed on the current global supply of food if it weren't so unevenly distributed. There's been some academics have come up with a model of efficient energy consumption, which worked out if the planet simply doubled its current renewable energy capacity, which isn't a lot, then if people consumed the same kind of energy that they did in the 1960s, wait, hang on, this is complicated. If the renewable energy capacity of the world was doubled, and then a population 3 times the size of what was on Earth in the 1960s could live at 1960s living standards, kind of thing. So, it is within reach if things were organised differently. And some more examples is things like the emissions of the world's largest institutional emitter of carbon dioxide isn't any relation to the number of people on the planet or the size of the working class, because it's the US military. What's that got to do with overpopulation? And energy usage per capita is orders of magnitude higher in the imperialist nations than in some of the poorest. So the US uses 6 times more energy per person than Cuba, for example. And this sort of points to what could be possible in an economically just society, and that's even before any more restorative policies are considered. So socialism or barbarism has long been a refrain of the communist movement, and it's now updated to socialism or extinction, or as some FRFI material has put it, capitalism is extinction and socialism is survival. Because of the 2 great camps described by Marx and Engels, only one can save both classes from extinction, and it's the working class which is today the much larger of the 2 in the global population. So we must fight for socialism in the long-term interest of the whole of humanity. In the oppressed nations, millions are already paying the price of imperialist inaction on global warming and imperialist exploitation of the natural world. And even in the imperialist nations, fewer and fewer working class people will be able to benefit from a green future where electric cars, etc., are the order of the day. And instead, we're heading for a new period of enclosure, more privatisation of common property, atomisation of society, and more dispossession. More and more people conscripted into the reserve army of labour, more unemployment. And so only a shrinking number of billionaires will be truly protected from the brunt of environmental catastrophe. And that's all I've got for now.
What's the point of that?